You know, you haven't really lived as a storyteller until you've achieved a TPK during Session 0. Today, we're going to talk about how to use Session Zeros as part of your Pathfinder 2e campaign on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is preparing to run a Session 0 by practicing my skills as a cat wrangler. The odds of success are about the same. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're going to be continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series, a series of videos where we are studying through the Gamemastery guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, taking a look at the tools and advice that Paizo offers for storytellers in Pathfinder 2e. This video series is intended for storytellers of any skill level, from beginner to advanced, and hopefully will be beneficial to storytellers of any RPG system, not just 2e storytellers. I strongly believe that by studying the ideas in a multitude of RPGs, you can find inspiration for adapting your favorite RPG and improving the stories that you tell. So I invite you to join me in this journey as we take a look at the advice that Paizo offers to their storytellers. And today in specific, we're going to be looking at the concept of the Session 0. We're going to be asking, what is the Session 0? We're going to take a look at the things you should do for a Session 0, and I'm going to offer some of my tips and tricks for how you can use a Session 0 to set the stage for a successful campaign. So, let's get started. First up, what is a Session 0? Well, a Session 0 is essentially a non-session of a new Pathfinder 2e campaign. Now, obviously this can apply to any RPG, but when you and a group of friends are getting together and setting up a new campaign or a new game, then a Session 0 is essentially where you and your friends come together not to play the game, but rather to set the stage for the game. It's where you create characters and set expectations for the story and work together as a group to gather the pieces of the campaign that you're getting ready to participate in. Ultimately, a Session 0 is a collaborative project that sets the stage for a fantastic story and a fantastic time at your table. Now, I would like to note that Session 0 is a slightly advanced storytelling topic, just because Session 0s really work the best for an extended game of some kind. You typically don't have Session 0s for a one-shot adventure. Rather, a Session 0 is used when you and your friends are planning on playing multiple sessions together, maybe over several weeks, several months, or maybe even a year or more. So if you're just looking at running a one-shot session, this video may not be the most applicable, but when you're interested in a more long-term campaign, a Session 0 is definitely a concept you want to take a serious look at. We can celebrate we are officially in the first chapter of the Gamemastery Guide. We made it out of the introduction, and Chapter 1 introduces us to the concept of the Session 0 very early. It's one of the first things that Paizo talks about in Chapter 1 of this book. But I will go ahead and tell you there's some content later in Chapter 1 on the subject of campaign design, session design, adventure design, encounter design, those kinds of things that I think you want to think about if you're pulling together a Session 0. So if you want to read about Session 0 in this book, check out the beginning of Chapter 1, but I also encourage you to check out pages 36 through pages 51 of the Gamemastery Guide. There's a lot of material in there that I think is very relevant, and you at least want to begin processing if you're going to do a Session 0. In particular, page 39 has some really important stuff that you want to be aware of. But with those references out of the way, let's get started. Now, in my opinion, I think that there are 3 things you really should do if you want a successful Session 0, and then I think there is one optional thing that you can add to a Session 0 that in many instances can be very positive. There are 3 things that are absolutely mandatory for a good Session 0, and the first and most significant of those things is creating characters. This is probably the step of a Session 0 that most of us are familiar with. It's when you and your friends get together and you bust out the character sheets and the dice and the pencils and the books, and you go through the process of putting your character on paper and getting them ready for the adventure ahead. It's exciting, you've got all these ideas and all of these different prospects of what you can possibly do, and character creation is honestly one of the most entertaining parts of any TTRPG out there. Creating characters is just naturally exciting. And that's why I think that this first item of Session 0 is so important, because creating characters can go wrong. And if you don't create characters in the right way, you can wreck your story before it ever begins. And spoiler alert, really experienced players are more likely to make this mistake, at least in my experience. I have seen a lot of very experienced players create characters that unintentionally wrecked their games. From Session 0, you knew that there was going to be trouble. So with that in mind, I think it's better to say that the first thing you want to do during Session 0 is create characters as a group. There are a lot of great character concepts in TTRPGs, and there's a lot of fun different stories that you can tell. But one of the hard things to realize is not every character is a good fit for every story or every gaming group. I've seen experienced players bring great characters to a gaming table that I instantly knew would not be a good fit for the story that I was telling or for the group that they were going to be a part of. And that's why I think it's so important, especially for an extended story that you and your friends are going to be working on together, for people to create characters as a group so that the group can bounce ideas off one another and work out details with one another, so that hopefully there will be a good fit between the characters that are in the story. And you, as the storyteller, have a bit of a responsibility here to help guide your group so that they can create characters who are essentially going to play well together. It's tricky. You can't force your players to do anything. An experienced game master knows that's an impossible task. But you do want to try to guide the conversation and encourage your players to work together to create characters that will fit reasonably well in the story that you're telling and in the party that's being created. And I think that there are 3 considerations here. First, as a storyteller, you want to clarify the kind of game that you're running so that your players know what kind of characters are going to be a good fit. Second, you want to model and encourage generosity in character selection. And that's going to be a little bit of a complicated and maybe controversial point, so don't worry, we'll dive into it. And then, last but not least, you want to encourage your players to be flexible in character design so that their characters can fit well together. Let's break these down. First up, you want to communicate the kind of story that you're telling so that your players know if their character fits or not. At the core of this idea is basically, as a storyteller, don't surprise your group, at least not too much, with the type of story that you're going to be telling. If you plan on running a really intense social drama with a lot of espionage, and one of your players shows up with a barbarian that deliberately dumped charisma, that player's probably not going to have much fun. Doesn't mean the character's bad, it just means it's not a good fit for the story. And so as a storyteller, you want to, at least in broad strokes, communicate to your players, both before and during the Session 0, what kind of story you're going to tell. That way, they know what kind of characters are likely to be a good fit, and what kind of characters may not be the best idea for that kind of story. In my most recent 2E campaign, I told my players that the opening scenario was going to be part of a refugee caravan trying to escape from the collapsing nation of Last Wall, which is being overrun by undead due to the return of the Whispering Tyrant. So my players know that at least the first major campaign arc is going to feature survival and stealth and this desperate rush for the border as a major element of the campaign. And as a result, they were able to use that information in crafting their characters so that they would be a better fit for the type of story that they knew was coming. Now, obviously, I haven't given away major villains, major plot points, things like that, but I gave them the broad strokes so that they had an idea of where their characters would be and what mindset their characters needed to be in. Now, my second point here, as I said, this might be a bit controversial, but please stick with me for a second. As a storyteller, I think it's healthy for you to model a generosity when it comes to character creation and character selection. Which is to say that, at least in my opinion, that there should be a bit of a priority in who gets first shot at character creation. Now, this is very much a personal opinion, but I believe that new players and players who don't get to join games very often should have first shot or at least higher priority in terms of picking their character concepts, because I think that that's going to be more beneficial to the group. Now, my reason for this is simple. Excitement is very powerful at your gaming table, and for new players especially, you really want them to be excited about the game that they're going to get to play. Not just because excitement is infectious, but also because excitement is motivating. Learning a TTRPG is complicated. There's all these new rules and concepts and ideas that you're trying to wrap your head around, and if you're not excited about the game, you're probably not motivated to learn the game. So in my opinion, I want the new players to be very excited about their characters, because that's going to motivate them to dive into the game and really take the time to learn the game well, which is beneficial to the group overall. By the same token, if you have someone who has some experience playing RPGs, but because of life circumstances or just different things that are going on, they maybe don't get to play very often, giving them first shot at picking their character can also go a long way to bringing a lot of excitement to the table. And to highlight this, I want to share a story of a time that I was given priority. I was invited to play in a Pathfinder 1E game, and I was super excited about the Arcanist class from Pathfinder 1E. I couldn't wait to try it. I loved the idea, I thought the concept was so cool, and I just really wanted to play a Pathfinder 1E Arcanist. But, as you've heard me say, I'm usually the forever GM. I don't actually get to play very often, so when the opportunity to actually play opened up, I was like, hey, this is my chance. I might get to play my Arcanist that I've been thinking about for months now. However, going into the game, I kind of curtailed my expectations a little bit, and I said, you know what, I want to be flexible, I want to be positive for this gaming group, so I'm going to develop this Arcanist idea of what I'd like to play, but I've also got a Cleric concept over here that I think would be a lot of fun, so I'm going to develop both of these concepts, and I would be perfectly happy playing either one of these two, and I'll just take whichever one is the best fit for the group. So I go into the group and we start trying to create our characters, and almost immediately it becomes apparent no one is playing a healer. The party does not have any healers whatsoever. And so I say, well, it's pretty clear that this group needs a healer, so my second concept is a cleric, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to roll up my cleric because that's what this group needs. And there was a girl in this group who actually stopped me and she said, no, Mark, you're always telling stories for us. You don't get to play very often. So I'm going to adjust my character and I'm going to play a healer so that you can play this Arcanist, because I know you've been talking about the Arcanist for months. I want you to have a shot to play that. I've got to tell you, that is one of the best memories I have at a gaming table. I was so genuinely touched that someone was willing to adapt their character concept so that I could have priority in the character I wanted to play, that I was super excited about that game. As someone who didn't get to play very often, it felt really good for someone to say, I'm going to take second place, and I'm going to let you choose your character first, so that you really get a chance to play what you want to play. Obviously, we cannot force our players to play this or play that. We can't force our players to fit in certain boxes, but as storytellers, we can model a generosity at our tables where we are mindful of the new players and mindful of the people who might not get to play very much. And I think when we do that, it fosters a healthier environment at the gaming table. And when you have a group that is willing to adjust their character concepts so that people get to play what they want to play, it really helps create a more positive environment. And here's the thing, this idea that I'm pitching doesn't have to be this ironclad restriction on players at your table, because quite often a little bit of flexibility goes a long way in helping everyone at your table to ensure that they're having a good time. If you have two players who are both interested in playing the face of the party, they want to push their charisma really high and be involved in the social challenges that the party faces, then you don't have to say one person gets to be the face and the other person doesn't. Instead, you can look at this situation with a little bit of flexibility and let one person focus on maybe diplomacy and the other person focus on intimidation. Good cop, bad cop, if you will. Encouraging your players to be flexible in their character concepts can help ensure that your group is going to fit together well and play together well, which ultimately leads to better stories. And so all of this taken together is why the very first thing you want to consider for a session 0 is creating characters as a group. You want your players to know what the story is going to be, at least in broad strokes. You want your players to develop their character concepts together and kind of work out the party dynamics together, all with the goal of creating a party that's going to mesh reasonably well inside of the story and mesh reasonably well with the story. Creating characters as a group is one of the fundamental things to setting the stage for a strong and memorable campaign. Now, the next thing that you want to do during a session 0 is to set expectations for the game. And this is about more than just the story itself. You want to set expectations for how the game will be run. You want to set expectations for what is considered good and bad behavior during the game. You want to make clear what your expectations as a group are so that everyone is comfortable at the gaming table. Now, this is a session 0 item that is going to vary in importance from group to group, because depending on who you're playing with, you may not need to do as much in this category as you would with other groups. If you're playing with several very close friends, and you know your friends well, and you know their boundaries well, you know what they're comfortable with, you know what they like and what they don't like, or if you're playing with a group that you've played with for a long time, and you've built a strong rapport, you probably don't have to do as much for the setting expectations. Meanwhile, if you're playing with a new group, or if you're bringing someone new into the group, you probably should take some time to set expectations so that everyone is clear where the boundaries are and what they should expect. Are there jokes that are off limits at your table? Are there certain types of language or certain content that some of the members of your group aren't comfortable with, and so you as a group have just said, we're not going to make this a part of our game? Setting those expectations before the game ever begins is very important, because that prevents the awkward situation of someone brings it up when they shouldn't and it just stops play. Now, this is an area where there are a million different variables, and I don't know if I could do a video touching on every single expectation you might want to discuss as a gaming group. And even with experienced gaming groups, there's probably going to be small items from campaign to campaign that you'll want to do this for. Maybe in one campaign you have a problem with certain people are taking up too much time relative to other players, and so when you start the new campaign, during that session 0, you set an expectation of everyone at the table gets their time to shine, and you talk through what that means for your group. That's just one example of an item that might come up. But the reality is, for the health of your campaign, it's a good idea to set the expectations with your group as to how you will play, what is okay during play, what is off limits during play, and what you hope to get out of the game. By the way, setting expectations is not just heavy conversations. I know the examples I've been giving so far may sound like depressing or difficult or hard topics, but those aren't the only things you need to talk about. You also want to set the expectations of what the goal of the game is. Several years ago, I ran a Pathfinder 1E campaign, and in the city of Absalom, in the largest city in the world on Golarion, there is this place called the Starstone Tower, and if you pass the test of the Starstone, you can become a deity in the setting. And so, several years ago, start of one of my 1E campaigns, I told my players in Session 0, the goal of the campaign was one player was going to get to the top of the Starstone Tower and become a deity. I told my players, start of the campaign, that's the goal. And you better believe my party was excited, and there was a lot of conversation about, ooh, what if my character is the one who gets it? And, by the way, that particular character is now an official deity in my table's version of Pathfinder. Part of setting expectations is establishing good boundaries for your group, but the other part of setting expectations is setting the goals for your group, setting the goals for your story, and really saying where you want the story to go and what you want the story to be about. And this is an area where your players can speak up and say, here's what we want to do, here's what we're excited about, and then you know as a storyteller, I need to put this in the campaign because this is something that they expect to see. Now, all of this leads into what I think is the third thing you really want to do during a Session 0, which is you want to give your players a chance to influence the story from the very start. I always give my players some kind of story element that I want them to develop outside of their character that I then get to use as part of the story that I'm going to tell. Now, I tend to be very formal and direct about this. In my most recent Pathfinder 2e campaign, my players were going to be part of a refugee train trying to escape the collapsing nation of Last Wall. And as a result, I told all of my players that they had to develop some of the other refugees that were part of this particular wagon train that was making for the border. I swear, not just because I need hostages as a storyteller. No, really. This particular writing assignment that I gave my players was an intentional action on my part. I wanted them to help develop part of the world that they were going to be playing in. I wanted them to develop some of the characters they'd be interacting with, and I wanted them to have some influence on the story before the story even began. Now, like I've said, I do this very formally anytime I tell a campaign. I always give my players some expected element of their backstory or some expected element of the world that I want them to create and develop that they then hand off for me to use. But you don't have to do it as formally as I do. If you have players who really get into writing character backstories and they really like to come up with ideas, you can definitely let your players freeform this and find some inspiration inside of whatever they write. But I strongly encourage you as a storyteller, make it a point to let your players influence the story and let your players know that they are influencing the story. When your players realize that they are part of this collaborative effort to build a story together, they're going to be more invested in the story. And I truly think it's one of the secrets in really setting the stage well for whatever campaign you're trying to run. So, when you do a Session 0, in some way, formally, informally, big, small, don't care what it is, find a way to let your players influence the story you're about to tell, and I guarantee you it will pay dividends in the long run of your campaign. But now we come to the last optional element of a Session 0, and that's the mini-adventure. Basically, the idea is, once your players get done developing characters, once the character sheets are full and all of the information is recorded, if you have time, maybe you can run a short session for your players. It's not a full in-depth session, but rather it's just kind of a quick taste or a quick tease of the story to come. And the emphasis here is it is a mini-adventure. It's probably one fight scene or a very small dungeon or a very small moment that occurs prior to the formal start of the campaign. Now, one thing I want to say is, you never know for sure if you're going to be able to do this. If character creation runs long, you may not even have time to do this before everyone has to go home for the night. But it's always good as a storyteller to have some kind of idea in your back pocket of here is some small introductory thing that I can do for my players as kind of a quick session to kind of whet their appetite for the full game to come. Now the good news is you don't have to develop a lot because, as I said, this is intended to be a short adventure. If it's a fight scene, it's going to be a quick fight scene. If it's a social encounter, it's not going to take a long time to roleplay. It's probably literally going to be one scene and then cut for the start of the official game. But I do want to stress that if you run this mini adventure for your characters, that you want to make this mini adventure something they can win. You want to make it reasonably easy for them to win. If they're escaping from something, you want to make the escape something that's going to be fairly simple to pull off. If they're going to be fighting a battle, you want to make it fairly simple for them to win that battle. Whatever the case may be, you want this mini adventure to be successful. Mostly because starting the campaign off with a failure feels bad. It doesn't mean that you can't raise the stakes or introduce tension in any way with a mini adventure, but just know that if you're running your players through a short adventure with their new characters, the first thing you want them to do is have some sense of success leading into the larger story. But there is another more advanced option you can try. You see, there's nothing that says that the mini adventure that you run has to be one that features their new characters. The Gamemastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e includes a whole bunch of sample NPCs, low-level characters moving about in the world that you've created. And it wouldn't take much effort to pass out these NPCs, give them to your players, and let them play out some background characters that are part of the larger adventure that you're going to be sending your players on. If you want to raise the dramatic stakes really, really high, this is a great way to do it without making your players feel like the campaign is starting off on a bad foot. Several years ago, I was running a Pathfinder 1e campaign, and after everyone had created their characters, I took their character sheets and passed out some NPC cards of some NPCs that were working at a Pathfinder camp. And that Pathfinder camp got attacked by a group of goblins being led by the campaign's main villain. It was a TPK for these poor NPCs. And my players got introduced to the main villain of the campaign well before their actual characters would ever encounter that particular character. It helped me establish the stakes and scope of the story, and it established a ton of dramatic potential, especially when they were hired to go investigate the missing Pathfinder Society member that hadn't reported in a few months. Man, what could have happened to him? By using some NPCs in the setting, I was able to tell an opening story that really set the tone of the campaign in a really exciting and visceral way without making my players feel like they had just failed before the game even began. So if you're doing a long-term campaign, one idea you can definitely try: give them some NPCs and let those NPCs lose a battle against the new boss. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about running a Session 0 for Pathfinder 2e? What advice do you have for storytellers who are looking at starting a new campaign, and what things should they make sure are part of their Session 0s? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel so that you can be part of these conversations. If you're interested in being a part of the local disaster tour guide community, check out my Discord and Patreon pages, which are linked down in the video description. Thank you so much for being here, and have a wonderful day.